All right.
Wonderful.
Now on.
So, guys, thank you again. Have a great session and good luck.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. All right. So welcome, everyone, to our Teachers of EdTech panel hosted by the Boston EdTech Foundation. My name is Marty Rogaszewski. I am the Director of IT Business Analysis at Teach for America. But before that, I was also a teacher. So I wanted to host this panel, and I'll be your host for the evening. We are entering a time where teaching has gotten incredibly difficult. There is more pressure on teachers from administrators, from parents, from political leaders, and from themselves to improve student test scores while also being counselors and nurses and educators and coaches and mentors and second parents and all the other things that teachers do. At the same time, technological innovation has been supercharged by the pandemic. There is a high need for talent in technology firms, particularly in ed tech companies who need the perspective of teachers who both use their products and directly interact with students and families who potentially benefit from the technology that they create. When I was a teacher, there were so many different technologies I used, from student information systems to learning management systems to laptops and cell phones and learning platforms and online gradebooks. And I always wondered who were the creators of those products and how many teachers were actually working at these companies to represent the end user. So today, we have three amazing former teachers who made the transition into ed tech. We have Anthony Hernandez, who is the Strategic Partnership Manager at Google. We have Kendrick Perkins, who is a learning experience designer at Salesforce, and Brian Jones, who is a Scrum Master at Edmentum. So before we get started, I just wanted to lay down some groundwork for expectations. Please keep questions and comments appropriate. We've unfortunately had a few folks who have dropped some inappropriate comments in the chat before, and we do have Chelsea Giller, who has graciously volunteered to kick folks out if they are unprofessional in any way. So I just wanted to say that up front so that we can come into the event with a professional mindset. The second thing is that please use the chat as much as you want. Feel free to blow it up and express your feelings. I want this to be an interactive experience. So if you have questions, feel free to either ask them in the chat or come off mute and join the conversation. Third, we'd love to keep your camera on so we can see your faces. That being said, do what feels most comfortable to you. If you're having a bad hair day or you feel that your Zoom picture looks better, then keep your camera off, but it's always great to see faces. This event is meant to help you. All right, so I love all the conversation that's going in the chat right now. It is amazing. Just to start off, I wanted to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So let's start with Anthony, and then we'll go with Anthony, Kendrick, and then Brian. So start by telling us, what did you teach and what do you do now?
Yeah, happy to. First off, thank you, Marty. Thank you, Tim, and the Boston EdTech Foundation for the invitation. Always, appreciative of being able to get in front of teachers. So my name's Anthony Hernandez. I was a second grade teacher and a fourth grade teacher in Providence, Rhode Island. Absolutely loved teaching. I went into teaching thinking that is what I intended to do my entire life. And I saw a ton of people in the chat that are saying that they're former ESL teachers or are teaching ESL. Thank you. You're the only reason I know how to speak English. And what I do now, so a few years following my time in the classroom, now it's transitioned over close to 8 years or so. I work at Google as our Strategic Partnerships Manager for EdTech. What that really means is there are all these EdTech tools out there in the universe. I am the person who works to, one, help them basically be able to talk to our tools and platforms or integrate into our platforms. What does that look like? Why do we want it a specific way, or do we? And then what's our strategy behind how do we develop certain tools that we want the EdTech industries to use? What is it that we think is most beneficial, both from our own set of tools and then the rest of the set of tools out in the universe? How do we make sure that we are, in ways, standardizing how all these tools are able to talk to one another? And then looking forward, where's there, I always like to call it out as a framework that I like to use is like build, partner, or look for the future for like acquisition. That is the way that I like to frame the work, because there's a lot of amazing innovative solutions out there, and we certainly are not going to do everything, and there are people who know a lot better certain areas, so it makes a lot of sense that we partner with a lot of folks. And I absolutely love this job. It is never exactly the same, but always a lot of fun, and hope to have some of you ask questions around more details around it. I'll pass it back to you, Marty.
All right, thank you so much. And I hear a lot of like that like the skill that you developed as a teacher, which is that relationship building skill, sort of coming out into your work today. So that's really inspiring for a lot of the teachers out there who are trying to figure out what transferable skills they have. I'm gonna pass it over to Kendrick though. And just can you talk a little bit about what you taught and what do you do now?
Sure, yeah. So interesting, just like Anthony, I was actually a second and fourth grade teacher in San Antonio, but I taught math. I was not ELA at a KIPP school actually. And so I did that for a while and then decided I want to transition to EdTech. So in my current position, I am a learning experience designer at Salesforce on the global sales enablement team. So more or less what I do is we partner with account executives who are basically sellers and solution engineers who also kind of do some selling type work, and we help them do their jobs better, very simply. Especially in larger tech companies, you'll have, a company that has 50 different products, and then you ask sales folks to go and sell those products. They have an idea, but they need a lot of learning, and so we actually create that learning for them through design workshops and everything in between to make sure they're doing their job really well. So that's the work I do now.
Awesome, thanks, Kendrick. And I know that one of the things that a lot of teachers sometimes struggle with is all the terminology that exists in like tech world, like there's solutions engineers, and then there's all these abbreviations and stuff. And could you quickly define like what a solution engineer is?
Yeah, so solution engineers are basically people who come in during the pre-sales process, another term. So basically, so I got to put it simply, basically when a salesperson is going down a deal, you have basically two people who are kind of, owning the sales process of getting the client to come and sign. And the first person is account executive at Salesforce. They're called different things at other companies, but account executive, we call them at Salesforce. And more or less, they're like the head salesperson, right? But account executives tend to not be technical folks. They tend to be people who are really good at selling and persuading. So they partner with what we call a solution engineer. And solution engineers tend to be actually more technical people who work side by side with them to make sure all the tools and all the things that work together work really well, because account executives aren't technical folks. So think about a solution engineer as kind of like a technical salesperson during the sales process. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, and as a sort of instructional designer or learning experience designer, you kind of help to teach the solutions engineers about the platform as well as some of the AEs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So you're using some of your teaching skills as well, just in sort of a corporate setting, which
Very
is really
much
interesting.
So. I always tell folks the only difference between what I do now is, I was teaching 9-year-olds before, and now I'm teaching, people up to 90 years old. But ultimately, good teaching is still good teaching. It's all the same.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kendrick. And I'm just going to pass it over to Brian. So can you tell us a little bit about what you taught, and what you do now?
Sure. Yeah. I taught for 4 years. I did middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, the worst time of everybody's life. It's true, and you know it. I taught science for a couple of years. I did 7th and 8th grade, and then I moved to a technology class where I was attempting without much training, because I just had a conversation where my principal thought this would be a good move for both of us. I was in agreement. It's not like I got forced or anything, but I was trying to teach computer science. I don't know any code. I was trying to teach engineering. I didn't have any. My background is science. I didn't go to school to be a teacher. I got a science degree and then learned the teaching along the way. So I was one of those people who come in and lean on veteran teachers really hard and say, please teach me how to make a lesson plan and how to control my classroom, and struggled. But now I have moved into a Scrum Master position. And for those who aren't familiar with Scrum, it is a type of project framework. There's a whole lot of things that I could the people that are Scrum Masters would yell at me for wording this wrong, I'm sure, but there's a style of doing development over a long period of time with complex work. And Scrum is one of those types. It basically breaks down those development pieces into really small chunks and tries to handle the smallest piece possible over a 2-week period or a month period or something like that, and get a team to break that up into their own areas, so that they have something to focus on, and they have a bite-sized chunk, and you're able to inspect how well it's going in your processes and your teamwork and your collaboration on a regular basis. So my teams do it every 2 weeks. I have 2 teams. I think one team is 6, 7-ish, and the other is around 10. And my job as the Scrum Master is to help build those relationships with them, first of all, to understand what they are dealing with as far as the struggles they're having, the communication issues with other team members, people who are asking for features of the product, stakeholders who are creating the requirements and the new features and the new ideas, and bringing those to the team, and also empowering their voices so that they have their own opinions heard about how that development happens, and are able to put those opinions into the business and not just feel like they're doing grunt work because they were told what to do. So my job as a Scrum Master, going back to how we're all using our teaching things, I'm teaching them about the model of Scrum while I'm also building those relationships just like we do as teachers, and empowering them to find their own way of making their work the most effective that it can be.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And I see this like same themes of like communication, relationship building, and being able to break down concepts, right, in your current work, which are also skills that you've probably developed when you were a teacher as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's everything that I am trying to do comes from a conversation that I'm having with somebody who's on my team. So they may be struggling with something, and I ask another team member, are you struggling with this same thing? And then if it becomes a trend, then it's on me to follow up with other folks and figure out how can we make this better for my team members so that they're not struggling with this same thing for a longer period of time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brian.
Yeah.
This has been great so far. I'm really excited. Also, if people have questions in the chat, feel free to put them in. If not, I have a ton of questions and I'll keep going. But feel free to join the conversation as well. I guess I wanted to go back to Anthony and ask a little bit about, like, I think a lot of teachers are sort of wondering, like, how did you make the transition out of the classroom and into technology? Like, did you know, like, you wanted to like work at Google like ever since you were a teacher? Like, what were those steps that you took in order to transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, by no means. Working at Google was not like a plan. It was more happenstance. I think when I was in the classroom, there was a few things that I did call out in my, like, I remember having this notebook and trying to plan out, like, what would it look like if I left the classroom? And for me, there was a few things that I recognized, right? Like the area of work that I was very mission oriented around, really focused on, like, how do you both develop and build these models for greater equitable access to opportunity? And in my mind, somehow I got to this answer of like public-private partnerships. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, I don't have the right skill set today to like actually build partnerships. I don't know what that would look like. But I recognize that as a teacher, you do have tremendous toolkit of, hey, anything I've been able to do, like, I can teach myself other things. I can teach other people certain things. I can certainly like jump into anything. And you are the creator of culture. You are the person who develops a year worth of like learning, etc. So I was looking at organizations that had rotational programs, because when I was leaving the classroom, it was my first stint into the private sector. So I looked at a number of large organizations because my thought process at the time was large organizations are going to have the capacity to be able to invest into a program like a rotational program, and they'll still likely have a good amount of like senior exposure for those people, for those individuals to be able to say, all right, you're kind of experimenting because you're not going to be locked into, I'm a finance person, I'm a strategy person, I'm a marketing person. You kind of get the best of all worlds. And it allowed me to also take my time understanding like how does an organization actually run? Because a school is, yeah, don't get me wrong, schools can be huge. And school districts, I feel like, are still probably the most political beast that I've had to work in. But it is very different from an organization that is either 10,000 folks big or hundreds of thousand folks. So this was really helpful. The rotational program what is a rotational program? Great question. A rotational program is typically, and they change depending on what industry you're looking at. It allows you to come into a role, like consulting firms do this, a lot of business firms do this. It basically allows you to come in as an analyst level or like just a generalized business person. And you're able to look at a number of different functions within the organization. So sometimes there are even rotational programs that are just focused around one function, like marketing, and you might be just moving around the teams. Or for that matter, you might be saying, hey, I'm going to come in as the person that's focused on financial and risk, like strategy, and you'll be jumping around across a ton of different organizations. Happy to add more to that in the chat, but I recognize I've been talking for a little.
No, this has been really helpful, and we've gotten a lot of like questions here. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them. These are fantastic. But I guess, and I'll just sort of hop this over to anyone who wants to take it. But Chelsea's asking about, she says that there's a lot of teachers who probably found better work-life balance and higher pay and less pressure outside the classroom. And we're just wondering, like, what do you think schools and governments can do to make people more fulfilled in teaching? So I'm curious if anyone like wants to take a stab at that. If not, I can probably try to do it.
I mean, I have a very strong opinion here, so I'd love to share it.
Okay.
And you guys tell me if you agree with this. I've always centered the problem around class sizes because they're out of control, particularly in middle school level, because there's not as much choices in high school, and then there's not as many paras and another support staff in as there is in elementary school. In middle school, it's just kind of one teacher most of the time, maybe a co-teacher for special ed if it's that kind of course. But I had classes of 37, 40 kids in one room where it was just me. And that was one of 7 classes. And so if you total up my total caseload for myself, I'm dealing with, 150 to 200 kids in a day, and all of their parents and all of their behavior issues and all of what's going on in their lives. And that adds on a huge burden of outside of the classroom work. And so I think that's where a lot of teachers struggle, is they thrive in the room with the kids. They love doing what they're doing. But because of the requirements of all the things you have to do outside of that classroom time, not only planning, documenting, IEPs, all of the things that you're having to do, you're also having to follow up and build relationships with the kids and their families in addition to anything you're doing in the classroom. And I think that if they were able to pull those numbers down, even just having more teachers in the building to kind of balance the ratios, it would really, really make a huge difference for the work-life balance, even just the stress feeling that most teachers experience.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I found like when I moved from sort of the classroom to sort of like a more like nonprofit corporate setting, a classroom, quote unquote, of adults was maybe like a group of 5 that you were sort of trying to instruct, whereas like a classroom in a school is, as you said, like 20, 30, and, total maybe 150 as a cohort. So yeah, thank you for answering that. And I just want to go back to Anthony for a little bit, and then we can hear from Kendrick, because Anthony, there's quite a bit of interest in the rotational program, and I believe you started off at Thomson Reuters, is that right? And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about that. Like how did you find this magical program? Like how can other teachers essentially like find these programs that are out there?
Yeah, I wish I told you like there was a special way to find them. I remember at the time just like, given what I knew at the time, I thought, okay, I'm gonna look at, and it might have been as simple as like, I'm going to look at some of the top like 100 companies and see like industry wise, what do they fall into? At the time, the reason I chose Thomson Reuters, even to apply to, was because they were like a conglomerate. So they had a financial and risk business, they had a news business, they had a tax and accounting business, and a legal business. And my thought process here was, if I can jump into something there, it allows me to see a ton of different types of businesses. It also, like, theoretically would have allowed me to like work with people who were experts in certain spaces. I think I was a little naive because you're also coming in as a very junior person, and I'm trying to make sure I'm answering the questions. And I will call out, like, that was a good approach, just because you will find that if you're looking at a ton of other large companies, Google, Microsoft, etc., most large tech companies have programs like this, and it is not solely for those that are coming out of college, because I think we will probably hire if you have probably up to 5 years of teaching experience. Like, you could still apply for one of those graduate level programs, that they would still be considered like early careers. Don't get me wrong, like, there is this balance of, I'm not necessarily early career because I have X number of years of experience. But I've seen programs that are, you're coming from a different industry and you're trying to jump into tech. There are several of these types of programs, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. And yeah, someone is putting in here, oh yeah, that there are employers that are looking for, marketing interns, etc. That's 1,000% true. The last thing I will call out, I did want to just briefly touch on the question around like why people leave the classroom and what we could be doing to keep teachers in the classroom. When I joined teaching, I think all of us, we come into the classroom, you're not even thinking about like, what are we getting paid at the end of the day? I think you do the job because you're wholly invested in the job, and because it's a passion that you have, and you are mission driven around like the impact that you're having with these students. Coming from a first generation background and with student debt, I remember doing the math like that first year and thinking, how am I possibly supposed to be able, and as you know, Marty, we were part of Teach for America, so we received a stipend at the end of the year, which was like supposed to help us with our student loans while we were also in graduate school. So there was this portion of, I couldn't understand, like, at this pay rate, how am I ever going to be able to pay off the loans that I have, plus continue my education, which is a requirement in most states to be able to receive my master's, and then slowly move up the chain, but like still overwhelmingly, like, it didn't seem, I couldn't do the math to make it work out. And I remember coming back and forth to this because I felt like, at least in Teach for America, I always wondered, like, it was everyone also feeling the same way? Were we all coming from good schools? We came from a state school where, don't get me wrong, we didn't have the same level of debt as a private university, but I did think, is this a way that like it makes this puts a blocker or a challenge for a lot of people of color that are first generation to be able to come into the classroom? Because if you're thinking about, how am I going to pay off these loans? How am I going to be able to make a living off this? Teaching isn't necessarily the pathway for that. So I do think government needs to invest more in thinking about, like, one, how do we get teachers into the classroom? How do you build up that pipeline? What can we do for loan forgiveness? That didn't look, at the time, as you remember, our public loan forgiveness was like, I think a 2% chance that would be accepted after 10 years. So there wasn't a lot of promise in those things. And I would love to see something like that change.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there are a lot of blockers that are preventing people of color in particular, from continuing on teaching, and being able to like invest more in these endeavors is so important to ensuring that like education is both more fair and more equitable and is better for everyone. I wanted to pivot over to Kendrick because it's there was a question in here about master's certificate and whether it's necessary to make the transition. And I know that you got your master's degree at one point and then you transitioned over to Salesforce. Is that right? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how you're able to navigate that.
Yeah, no, I can talk about that. So, preference, it's going to vary depending on what position you go into. So for me, I'm a designer, learning experience designer. So it kind of all comes back to originally when I was in the classroom. I really enjoyed creating lessons and creating things for kids to do. And I wanted to really do that work, but I found that when you're teaching, that's like only like probably 1/4 of your job. It's like a whole other different slew of things. And so I really went to graduate school with that thing in mind. I mean, in graduate school, I really spent my time exploring different things to ultimately find like what made the most sense given my skill set, what I wanted to do. In my case, learning experience design just happened to align with kind of my interest in tech, my interest in design, and my interest in education. But before that, I actually didn't know it even existed. I learned about it when I was in graduate school. So for me, graduate school was a really, really big thing. And to generally answer the question of was graduate school, would I be where I am today without graduate school? Probably not in my specific case. I think graduate school offered me a really good kind of avenue to kind of start over. Because when undergrad, I actually studied art history, Spanish, and Portuguese, totally unrelated to education or tech. And I use graduate school for me as really a way to kind of redefine myself as a tech professional, right? And so do I think that should be the case for everyone? I also recognize I come from the privilege of even going to school and having the time and space to take off from that. That was a big thing when I was applying to school is I couldn't necessarily go to grad school for 2 years because that's money I didn't have, and so I ended up doing a 1-year program that still managed to give me that same experiences that I wanted to get out of it. But I find people in my position tend to go to school, tend to have a graduate degree. So why I say 10 is typically for folks who are trying to transition into learning design from teaching, which is very big right now. You find more and more the competition is getting a lot tougher. And to differentiate yourselves in that really tough competition, having a graduate degree tends to help. Though there are people who I find who have seen has also kind of been successful in this particular profession without a graduate degree, and those people tend to come from industry already. So someone typically coming from some kind of sales or engineering or something they want to transition. It's much easier when you come from those backgrounds to this work because of the interdisciplinary nature of this work. But for those coming from education, while it's not the best answer, generally I find to give a competitive edge, it's good to have a graduate degree plus some experience, which I can talk a bit more about later, how you actually get that experience when you go and decide you want to go into your first post-teaching job within design specifically.
Yeah, I found personally that a graduate degree sort of helps with sort of a natural transition. So if you are looking to change careers, you can say, oh, I'm going into graduate school to learn more, right? And then you can sort of use that in your interviews or in conversations in order to sort of send a signal to employers that, hey, this is something I'm looking to explore more. And there were a couple of questions in here about like, what was your graduate degree? And like, if you have any recommendations for particular, well, I guess it was, what's your graduate degree and what's the difference between learning experience design and instructional design or user experience design? I feel like those are a lot of separate questions.
Yeah, those are very good questions. So the first program I did was a program at Harvard Grad School of Education in Technology, Innovation, Education. Oftentimes you'll find a lot of grad schools of education have a program that's typically like learning design or instructional design or something design. That's generally what I have. You can see programs like it all across the country. And so that's kind of what I studied in graduate school. Secondly, that's a very good question Rebecca asked about learning experience design, instructional design, and user experience design. So in my experience, and this is kind of like on the low, they're all almost the same. So we find instructional design is typically the word that folks use, but actually one thing I kind of discovered when I was in grad school is there's so many different positions that teachers already qualify for, but it's just knowing the lingo and what to look for. Like, for example, what I'm doing now in learning experience design, it also goes by instructional design. It also goes by, you'll find people are learning coordinators, sales enablement, which I didn't learn until later, is basically the same thing, but for salespeople, of training and development, facilitation, learning technologists. These are all more or less 80% of the same job, the difference is like that small 20%. So thinking about specifically learning experience design and user experience design, the biggest difference between the two is your actual output. In terms of the design process, it's fairly similar. We do the same methodologies you would use as a learning experience, as a user experience designer, but instead of our output being a wireframe or being some kind of like visual asset that you typically do with user experience design, ours is some kind of typically text-based asset, be that a course or job aid or some kind of deck or something for facilitation. So to very succinctly answer the questions, they are different, but only 20% different. That I find that people who are in one tend to jump around in all the others without too much of a problem.
Okay. So moral of the story is, if you see like learning experience design, user experience design, instructional design, just apply for all the jobs, right?
Yeah, and look
They're
at
all
the
pretty
job
similar.
description too. Yeah, I find like some organizations define them differently. What I
Yeah.
find in like more smaller organizations, they kind of want you to do both versus large organizations like Salesforce and Google, for example, like they have very, very specialized roles. So I would also, when you're applying, look for those keywords, but be very explicit about the actual job description because they sometimes may allude to one more than the other.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kendrick. And we have a question, and I guess we can just open this up to any of the panelists about imposter syndrome, which I think is a really good one, a really interesting one, because when you're coming into like a corporate setting as a teacher, oftentimes you feel like this is very new and like you aren't necessarily prepared for the responsibilities of the particular role that you received, or even the role that you're interviewing for in general, right? So like, how do you sort of like build that confidence and make sure that you know that you are prepared? And did you face imposter syndrome, and how are you able to navigate that?
I can go because I haven't said anything in a while. And Anthony said definitely in the chat. And I was like, yes, definitely. I actually just today, my manager sent out a feedback survey to all of my team members for all of us, for the new Scrum Masters, because it was me and one other who got hired recently. And so I'm like on pins and needles waiting to get that back and know what people actually think about how I'm doing, because I have no idea. Honestly, I'm trying my best. I'm learning what I can. I'm trying to have these conversations, and some days I feel like I'm making a huge difference for my people, and some days I feel like I'm like, am I doing anything? Is this actually making a difference? The way that when I was in a classroom, when I would talk to a kid who was having a bad day and I cheered him up, or I had a kid get a really good grade who had a really bad grade, it was like clear indicators that I was doing a good job. And now I'm like trying to figure out what those indicators are so that I can kind of gauge for myself where my successes are. And yeah, it's tough. It's something I'm definitely still figuring out because I'm pretty new at this. So I think I'm looking for what those indicators are and hoping that more of them show up than I have now.
Yeah, and Brian, you transitioned pretty recently, right? So like, I feel like when you first enter a new role, like it's very easy to feel that imposter syndrome, and then after a while, hopefully at least, and maybe Anthony and Kendrick can answer this, you sort of gain more confidence and you understand the system, and you're like, I can do this, like I've got this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can speak to my own experience. So I think when it comes to imposter syndrome, it's important to note right off the bat that everyone experiences it to a degree. And if they aren't, then they're probably just lost and won't last very long anyway. And so what I've learned in my own experiences is that, first of all, embrace that you don't know, that you have a lot to learn, and that's entirely fine. Actually, most jobs I've found, when you actually say like, hey, I'm here to learn and want to know more, they actually encourage that type of thinking. We call it like being curious, but it's a really important skill to have, because no one likes someone who's arrogant. And so how that tends to manifest is I ask a lot of questions and get to know folks and truly try to understand as much as I can before I come in with an opinion, and folks love being asked questions. That's the whole idea of behind panels. So folks love being asked questions, and folks, love to show their expertise. So embrace that and do that. And what I found over time is the more you do that, the more that, you talk to folks, you embrace your own vulnerability, is that over time you actually gain an intrinsic confidence. And then confidence comes from, learning of failing, trying again, doing it again, working with other people on more than one or two or three different occasions. And and over time, you just kind of embody that thing. You fake it till you make it, to put simply. So I would say for folks dealing with imposter syndrome and new roles, especially in tech, where it can be kind of intimidating because so many smart folks, it's just embrace it, that you don't know, lean into it and learn as much as you can, because it will fade over time, typically around 6 months. If you were to even put a number on it, because most onboarding programs are 6 months. So that's generally when you can expect folks to kind of lean into knowing what they're doing and know how to do it well.
Good to know. Thank you.
We're giving advice to each other on the panel. This is great. So I just wanted to go over to Daniela's question, because it was actually a question that I had as well. And it's a question that we've sort of been touching the surface at, but I wanted to emphasize it a little bit more, is how do you navigate convincing the hiring committee of your transferable skills? How do you, what skills do teachers have that you find have served you well in your roles today?
I'm happy to start with this one just because, so I've had 2 experiences now where my teaching experience has been called out as, oh, I don't know if that's relevant. My first was at Thomson Reuters. Our final interview day, they bring you to, at the time it was on site, and there's an entire, I think there was probably 12 of us for only a few seats in this program. And similar to when you are in a classroom and you have 30 students that are sitting down in front of you, we had 30 assessors sitting down right in front of us. And the question I got from all 30 assessors at different times throughout the day was, why would we hire an elementary school teacher? Which in any tone never felt great. And I think at the time, for me, it was really around there's a few things that I bring that nobody else brings, right? There is a perspective that you have being a classroom teacher, especially when you're transitioning into EdTech. You have actually used a lot of these tools. You have been in the classroom. You understand what implementation looks like. You understand what it will look like for a student to use it, what the challenges, what are some blockers that other people are not thinking about from that perspective. I also think there's just nuance in what you've done every single day. I'll go back to saying it is difficult as a classroom teacher to show any success throughout the school year, but I'm going to hope that you've shown some sort of growth for your students. But it also means that you've cultivated a culture. There are folks that will look to be a manager. You have to have a good way of, one, communicating with your team, really developing a culture that people want to work with you, for you, be mission oriented on what is the scheduling for basic, let's call it project planning or program management. These are ways that you can say, hey, I've been able to take a student who needs intervention and really break down how is this person going to learn. All of these things are extremely transferable. I'll call out, even after a few years of having experience, when I was interviewing for a role at Microsoft, I'll never forget my phone screen. The person was looking at my resume and looked at my years teaching, and they were like, well, I don't see how that's relevant to this role, so we're going to dismiss this. And I felt so just taken aback by it, because I felt like I've invested so much, I still view myself as a teacher. Mm-hmm. So the last thing I wanted to think was, yeah, don't worry, you can dismiss that. And I gave her a 5-minute passionate speech on from being, at the time I was focused on behavioral analytics. And I called out here's why I can do this really, really well, both from a external communication perspective to, ecosystem of partners, internally being able to showcase the value of a certain product, and then really understanding the nuance of how are we going to solve for these challenges if we haven't been able to do X, Y, and Z. All of that is coming from being a classroom teacher. So never walk away from the fact that you have all this experience. Really lean into it. I would say take some time and just like briefly put together a few bullets, not like resume bullets that you're trying to come up with all day. Like really focus on like, what is it that I've done as a classroom teacher that are, you would be doing this in any other role. Doesn't matter whether you're a classroom teacher or you're a CEO of a company, you would likely still be doing the exact same things.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important. And I remember when I was applying for managerial roles and they're like, have you ever managed anyone before? And I was like, I managed a classroom of 60 kids. And they kind of like that answer because I was able to explain how being able to convince like 60 children about how math is really cool is a lot more challenging than convincing 3 or 4 people I'm managing to do the job that they're getting paid to do. So I totally hear that, and I really appreciate you like highlighting those skills. I'm gonna pass it over to either Kendrick and Brian. Brian, I see you're off mute. Did you want to take that on as well?
Yeah, I was going to say, I said in my interviews, if I can convince a 7th grade girl to do anything, I can convince anybody to do anything. I should go into sales, but I just don't really, I don't know. That's creeps me out a little bit. I don't know. But I think the difficulty is in the word translating, because a lot of the teachers, I mean, we have our own lingo as teachers. There's so many things that if you put any random person from one of our companies into a staff meeting at a school, they'd have no idea what's going on because they don't understand the lingo. Just like when we jump into there, we're having to learn all this lingo. That's where a lot of the imposter syndrome comes from, I think, as well. But in those interviews and on your resume and on your LinkedIn profile and on your LinkedIn posting, like you have to put everything in terms that those people understand. Because when you're talking about growth metrics, somebody said student growth, like if you're talking about grade increases, they don't know what that means. But if you were to put it in terms of sales or in terms of, I don't know, whatever metrics you're targeting for the specific company or the specific role that you're trying to get into, then that speaks to them. Just like, in a classroom, we try to contextualize our content for what a kid is, their background knowledge, right? You'd have to do the same thing for these people in a business, is you contextualize what you've done in the same way you contextualize information for a kid that you're trying to teach. It needs to be something that resonates with what they understand. And so I remember in one of my interviews, I kept telling stories about things that would happen with students and try to translate that into how I would say, this is how I imagine this would take place on a Scrum team, because I have no idea. I've never done it. So it helps a lot to actually do it, for one thing, whether that's volunteering or contracting or part-time or something. But without that experience, putting the terms and saying, I imagine that this is how it would play out in a similar way on a team in this job that I'm trying to get, that would resonate. And my new manager said multiple times, that really resonates with me about how you think that it would go, because that's a lot of the time how it does go. So a lot of times it's putting yourself in the shoes of that job you want and trying to imagine it, even if you're just like reading stories from people on LinkedIn. That actually was really helpful for me. That was one of the things I did early on, was try to follow Scrum Masters. Once I decided I want to be a Scrum Master, I think this is going to be perfect for me. It kind of has all of my best talents. I started following anybody I could find that was a prominent voice of Scrum Masters. Some of them are sketchy people, so you got to be careful, because not all of them are actual Scrum Masters. Not all of them are actually true Scrum Masters. Some of them are fake, and that's the case for any kind of position. But reading their content and understanding this is what their life is like gives you a little bit of that vocabulary, so that when you spruce up your resume or start trying to post on LinkedIn or something like that, once you get into those interviews, especially, you have a little bit more of the language and you can try to put yourself in those shoes. And that's where you're able to create that translation.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot about how I think one of the biggest challenges that a lot of teachers have is being able to translate their achievements to the language of the role that they are trying to have, right? Whether it's an instructional design role or a Scrum Master role or a strategic partnership role, because they haven't necessarily done it before. And it's just a lot of research that needs to be done. So Thank you, Jennifer. It's very, very challenging. It's a skill that like I had to learn. I still think on my resume, I still have my students grew 5.4 years on their STAR math assessment. I don't think anyone knows what a STAR math assessment is besides like my principal when I was a teacher, but I still have that on there. But I'm curious what other suggestions we have for like, how do we learn that language of technology or like a corporate setting?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll first start by just echoing the points that folks are mentioning. I think learning the lingo and learning the keywords and learning, what's important to folks in specific fields you're thinking about is super important. Like, much like Brian was speaking, when I literally, when I decided I want to go to EdTech, I followed every EdTech organization I could possibly like think of, and everyone that thought was an industry I followed as well. So like immerse yourself in that, learn the lingo is the first step, because you can't come in there talking teacher when you're trying to be a marketer. Like people, it just doesn't translate. So learn to speak their language. But then I think in terms of like thinking about your tangible skills and how they relate to the classroom, there's luckily like lots of different guides you can use nowadays that basically has you think about of what you do in terms of like industry. So like think about work I do now as a designer that's basically more or less curriculum and lesson planning is designing. Same thing, we tend to say, oh, we're organizing our classroom. Well, that's project management or in the case of thinking about, I find, in fact, the best communicators are teachers because imagine, going and presenting to clients every single day of the year for hours at a time when they may not want to listen. So through that time, you learn some really solid communication skills. So learn to speak whatever language you're trying to kind of, go into. But in terms of how I actually learned them myself, I think I immersed myself in. I tried different things and started and tried to get my hands dirty, because what I find was difficult when I was first looking for roles is that if you don't have experience something directly and can't speak to that experience that you have in a way that resonates with them, that you're very quickly dismissed. So as much as you can, try to get down first and foremost the hard skills. So in my world, it's like the tools that you need. There's like tools like articulate storyline and things like that. Learn the tools. They're probably the easiest and quickest thing you can do to kind of become familiar with the landscape first and foremost. And then I would say to really hone in and learn to tell a convincing story around your work. Just like, Anthony and Brian mentioned, I actually was just doing an interview a couple weeks back and I referenced of a work I did as a teacher because it translates very well if you know how to tell it in the right way. So learn your individual story, and get your experience and learn the tools for your trade. And experience can be hard to come by when you don't have things. But one thing I actually learned, a really interesting tool, is reach out to small organizations. Like I doubt you can reach out to the Googles and the Salesforce and the Amazons. It's really difficult to try to get in the door there. But like there's lots of small ed tech companies with like 10 people that would love some help, and just be like, offer yourself to help and get those bullets on your resume, because that is equally as valid as what you did in the classroom. It's going to help build a narrative for yourself. So I would encourage folks to get those hard skills down, learn to translate what they're doing in their role as a teacher to the corporate setting, depending on what role you're applying to, and also get some experience by trying small projects with through boot camps or whatever, through formal education, or by reaching out to organizations and just lending a hand in any ways that you can.
Yeah, I like that suggestion of sort of looking into small ed tech companies, because it is really hard to get your foot into the door of like a larger organization like Google or Salesforce when you don't necessarily have that technology experience. But a lot of those smaller companies are open to it. And I think one of the approaches that I was taking when I was looking for roles originally was I just applied for companies that I worked with as a teacher. Like I did IXL with my students as math, so I applied to jobs at IXL. Or like I use Power School for my grade book, so I applied to jobs at Power School, right? And that way you can at least say like, I've used your product, I'm an end user, like I'm its biggest advocate, I love it. And I found that that was at least a good starting point. But there are thousands of companies out there, right, that are pretty small and open to having that experience as well. I'm looking through the chat, and Danielle, I see a question about how long the professional transitions took. Could you maybe come off mute and say a little bit more about that?
I'm just wondering timeline wise, like, was it around a year, 6 months? Like, if you feel comfortable sharing.
And by like transition, you mean like how long did it take from application to like start applying to get the job, or like to get from teaching to where they are right now?
Oh no, the first role when you were transitioning out of direct service education.
Oh, okay.
So I'll say, I mean, I kind of made the hard decision to get out in January, and I had a backup. I was telling my principal that I was trying to go to high schools instead of middle school. I wanted to try something different, just so that when the contract issue came up, that I was kind of ahead, and he was at least starting to prepare to fill my role regardless. But I kind of decided in January, and then I got hired in June. So about 6 months for me. And I think that from what I have heard, that was exceptionally fast. I don't know if the other guys would agree.
I think for Thomson Reuters, because it was a structured program, I remember I started in September, but I can remember applying in like October of the year before. So it took a long time because basically there were windows. Like you had to apply by a certain date, then you knew if you were going to be invited for an interview by a certain date, and then round 3 interview by a certain date, but like that was the final one. So I think ultimately I probably knew that I was hired maybe like May-ish. Feels right. It took a while, but like, yeah, it does take, I feel like 6 months, like at minimum is like a good block of time to at least set out.
Yeah, similar experience with me. I think for me, I also had the buffer of graduate school, so of more or less, I finished teaching, then went immediately to graduate school for a year. But I would say, when I started applying for roles, I graduated in May. I started applying for roles in January. And, I kind of came with this idea like, oh, it's a degree from Harvard, I'll be fine. I was not fine. I got so many rejections. I didn't get a job until like May. I think like a couple days before graduation. So, if someone's thinking about leaving the classroom, I would put at least 6 months in mind, and actually proactively start of like, through your formal education, if you can, through certifications or online programs, of connecting, networking with folks, so that, when your time comes, that you already have something in mind, because it will take 6 months to a year if you're trying to transition careers, depending on what kind of companies you're going into. Smaller companies tend to be a bit more easier to get in the door versus larger companies. It's going to be a whole process.
That was the only thing I was going to add, which is like, certainly I work with a lot of EdTech startups, and I will say like they are probably the fastest of being able to say like, hey, we're hiring. And then within like 2 months, they're like, hey, let me introduce you to so-and-so. They're our new director of engineering. And I'm like, oh, I felt like you just told me you were hiring. So if you're looking for something that moves faster pace, like, yes, smaller organizations certainly do.
Awesome. That's really helpful. And yeah, so it's good to sort of get a sense. And to circle back to something that Kendrick was saying, I think it was interesting. I know with a lot of technology roles, you're going to get a lot of rejections. Like a lot of people, they apply like to 300 roles. Like it's literally in the hundreds, and then you might get interviews for like 10% of them. It's very common, just because, especially for bigger companies, they're getting a lot of applications, a lot, like in the hundreds, maybe not the thousands, sometimes the thousands, but it's something to expect, and it's something that you kind of have to work yourself up for, based on what I understand. I'm curious about the application process. I sort of asked this a little bit, and then so I'm going to ask one more question actually, and then we'll go into some more audience questions. But like, what recommendations would you have for teachers who want to make the transition into ed tech? Like, is it worth like writing a cover letter? Like, is it worth like filling out all the like information on those like applicant tracking systems where you have to like type in your education and your experience all the time? Like, what about like networking and informational interviews? How does that work? So I'm just curious what suggestions you would have.
My top recommendation for sure, or at least for me personally, would be LinkedIn. My job came almost purely from LinkedIn. I started, like I said, in January trying to look and started trying to follow some people. I did somebody asked about cert programs. I did the Google project management certificate. I've heard good things about the other one. I had a friend who was a teacher who did the data analysis program with Google, and she got a job right away as well. So those are good. I know for Scrum, I ended up taking the Professional Scrum Master 1, which is on scrum.org. I did that in, I want to say April. I took it once and failed it because I didn't realize it was open book because I was a teacher and nothing is supposed to be open book apparently. Anyway, that second time I took it, it was fine. But as far as the application process and how to actually get a job, LinkedIn was my best friend. My manager told me that our CTO at the company found my LinkedIn profile from hashtag transitioning teacher stuff. I don't even know what he was looking for. I don't know how he found my page. I don't know why it popped up on him, but he sent it to my manager and said, hey, talk to this guy about our Scrum Master openings. And so he reached out to me because I was posting and commenting and making it known that I was knowledgeable about this position. And through my activity on LinkedIn, made myself at least noticeable, where what Marty was just saying about those applications, a lot of times I don't have the buzzwords because I don't have the dedicated experience. I think Kendrick especially is going to have a bit of a different way of going about this, because for design, you have to actually show that you know you've done it, right? You have to actually prove and tell that story to somebody by what you have created. But if you're doing a more soft skill kind of job, or if you just don't actually have the ability to create that experience on your free time from teaching or something, then LinkedIn is going to be your best friend, because you can show that you can speak the language, you can speak to the position, you can learn about it. I've told a lot of people in like messages and stuff on there that you have to follow people who are in the role that you want. You have to pick like one or two, max two things. A lot of I went in and was like, I'm gonna be a project manager or a customer success manager or blah blah blah, a bunch of other things. Once I trimmed it down to Scrum Master and knew that was my target, and I was following those people, and I was posting with hashtag Scrum Master and hashtag PSM and hashtag Scrum and hashtag Agile, and those things were popping up on people's feeds who were way out already in this field and doing the work. And so I would ask a question. So first you have to follow people, then you have to comment, which is kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, but you have to actually put a comment on somebody's page when you don't know anything about it and say, this is really helpful information. Thank you for posting it. Here's my thoughts and here's a question. Because then you invite responses, and you invite you show that you kind of know it and you're interested in it enough that it starts a conversation. And then asking a question doesn't make it sound like you're dumb or that you're unknowledgeable. It makes it seem to people that you are curious and engaged and invested, and that's something people want to see, and it's inviting. So the more you comment in that way, and then I use the same strategy for posts. I would say, this is what I'm learning, this is maybe where some gaps are, these are some people that I have followed that have been really helpful, and here's my question. I usually actually would start with the question because that gets people to want to read more. but yeah, I have a lot more to say about LinkedIn, but I've been talking a lot, so
Yeah,
that was huge.
Yeah, and Brian, I know that you are very active on LinkedIn, and that's been super successful in your job search. And a lot of people found success just by being active, engaged in whatever community, whatever job they're looking for. And people like they actually get recruiters to reach out to them when that happens, which is pretty cool. And I'm curious, either from like Kendrick or Anthony, what like are there any other like tips that you'd have besides LinkedIn? Because I think LinkedIn is great, but I'm sure there's other strategies.
Yeah, no, I can speak to a bit about that. But I first got to echo the LinkedIn thing. It's like it's develop a LinkedIn presence. Like legitimately, I've never actually the jobs that I've gotten, I've never actually applied to. People have come to me. So get a
Wow.
LinkedIn presence. It's really important. One thing that I did, that it's kind of like very intrinsic to teaching, but you don't think about it in terms of professional development in your career is like backwards planning, right? So I decided at one point, like I wanted to become a designer. So first thing I did, to Brian's point, I went and found people who I aspired to be like, oh, I like this person's profile, I like what this person's do. But what do they do? Go through their profile, then go and find out what are the key like experiences, what are the words they're using. I literally just copy pasted sometimes, and then went to job descriptions, did the same. And decided, okay, this is what they're saying in jobs. How can I tell my own story from that perspective? So it like resonates with the language that's being used in the job. So it's a lot of like honestly imitation first and foremost, because you got to learn the lingo. It's of course, it's not like, making up experience by no means, but you're going and finding out the right language to use, and making the right connection. So I encourage folks first and foremost to start with someone they have in mind that they want to emulate and be like, and find out how they got to where they are. Sometimes even doing like a info session or a call, people will be happy to chat with you sometimes, and see how you can emulate them and how you can shape your experience in their own way. And to Brian's point too about designers, you have to have a portfolio. Develop a portfolio if you're in and want to go into learning design, which is a lot of teachers tend to go into this field because it's very similar. But I would say don't discount your teaching experience. I see so many people try to like reinvent themselves online as like this, project manager / ex teacher, but it just comes off as disingenuous. So don't discredit your own experience. Like I find with the portfolio, one thing I didn't do, I would definitely have done in retrospect, now that I know what I know, is actually use what you've done in the classroom to build the portfolio. You'd be surprised by how much, like, especially if you taught during COVID, of to teach online, like that's doing learn design right there. And speak to that, and being able to speak to it, I think is a really big trait that you ought to go and get really good at. Storytelling, and during interviews, they will always ask you, tell me about a time. Have convincing stories, and being able to know what your story is so that you can convince others that you're worth taking a chance on. So, to kind of recap, learn your narrative, of find an exemplar person that you want to be like, emulate that person, talk to them as much as you can, as well as the roles that you want to apply to, and then also make sure you develop a really robust LinkedIn presence and use all those keywords so that recruiters can find you online.
Yeah, and that last point you made about behavioral based interviewing is really huge in tech. They love to hear stories, star stories in particular. If you ever want to like know what a star story is, Google it. Situation, task, action, results. But those are really big in tech, from what I understand, and just in interviewing in general. But yeah, thank you for sharing, Anthony. Any other suggestions?
LinkedIn for sure. Yes. Echo everything. I think from a resume perspective, one of the things I have seen often is like it's a description of what you've done, which makes a lot of sense because it's on your resume. There is this thing at Google that they try to make us always mindful of, that your resume should really be like, it's formulaic, where it's like it should be X like has translate into Y, which is the result, like in results into Z. And I'm like, okay. And it is very difficult to do. And I think I've gotten it right like only a few times. But I'll look for a link on this because I know that they like publish this so that other people do this when they're applying to Google. And oh yeah, someone did put this. Great, awesome. Because weirdly, when we do look at resumes, I think we look at them like by the time they're surfaced to us, you know, from a recruiter standpoint, they've already gone through like an initial screening and everything else. And we are taking minutes at most, like looking at a resume, and we're really determining, hey, yeah, let's just get on the phone with like at least 5 people as soon as possible. And because we recognize that like the cycle to hire someone is going to be much longer because of the fact that it's a huge organization. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. All right, I'm just going to pass it over to people who are listening in to see if they'd like to ask any questions. I see some people with their cameras on. Thank you, Isabella, Anna, Victoria, Rebecca, Joseph, Jacqueline. You're all amazing. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them right now. All right, I'm using a teacher move of wait time, and I think it worked. Go ahead.
That gets me every time. I'm Rebecca. I'm from Mississippi. I was wondering if y'all could speak any about the accessibility. Everybody is talking about, like, from the UX design stuff I've been studying for a couple months now. It's like a really big term about the accessible, like web accessibility. And if any of y'all have any opinions about, I don't know, I was trying to make my portfolio kind of a little bit like focused on that. And so I've done some studying about that. Is that really important, or is this just like a buzzword that's being thrown out there? Because I know in teacher land, that happens a lot where we talk about like, oh, social emotional learning and mental health is so important, but it wasn't really. And so I'm kind of wondering, is this the same thing where we're like, oh, accessibility is so important. Is it really important in your companies, or is that just something I'm hearing like this buzzword?
So I'll speak to Admentum. I mean, Kendra's going to have a lot to say about it too, because it's a design specific thing. But I would just say, because ours is education specific, there's a lot of that. So every feature that is being designed, the design team is focused on accessibility. Like they're going back to all of the regression of everything that has been made and trying to make sure it is all accessibility appropriate. And I would imagine, I don't know this off the top of my head for sure, but I would imagine that they are pulling people, hiring new folks to make that an accomplishable goal with the people that we have on the teams. So definitely from my perspective.
Yeah, I can speak a bit about that, Rebecca. So accessibility is important in the work that we do, that we make sure that all our content is accessible as possible. Now, so your question around when you're creating a portfolio, of what I would say in that is when you tell your story of, first of all, know accessibility terms, so be familiar with those terms first and foremost, and know what accessibility actually means. Because a lot of folks, surprisingly, being on hiring committees, don't actually know what it means when they're talking about it. It's like, that's not actually accessibility, that's something totally different. So know what it means, know the terms, be able to speak to how you integrate accessibility into your learning designs. You don't necessarily have to, be like, it doesn't have to be entirely accessible. Think about, I think, what's more important and what all organizations are emphasizing when you're creating a portfolio is making sure you can speak to accessibility and how you can make your content more accessible. Oftentimes the goal is very, very big. A lot of us don't reach it even in corporate environments, but you have to be able to speak to it. But I would even say emphasize even more when you're creating portfolio is being on, interview panels for other designers, is that you have to be able to tell a convincing story around your design methodology and why you chose what design decisions. So I think when you're crafting a portfolio, make sure above all things else, you can to be able to vocalize, I make this design decision because A, B, and C, and using this method. And typically there's lots of standardized methods for design. So try to think about those things most very closely, because when you are in interviews, they'll grow you on those things above all things else.
For working at Microsoft, like I can just briefly say, and on LinkedIn, you'll probably easily find them. There are folks their entire job is accessibility focused. There are product leads that solely focus on this. And yes, I would say it is part of product that is across every line of product that we put out. So do I think it's a buzzword? Probably in some way, shape, or form, sure. I think it's one of those things, though, that from a tech perspective, it is going to be something that is persistent and remain persistent across development, design, implementation, etc.
I don't work for a tech company. I never had a portfolio. I'm just gonna say that. I've never done that. I mean, I'm sure it's helpful if you're like applying for like a very technical role. And I'm sure it doesn't hurt. There's no way that a portfolio can hurt. Like it's a display of the projects that you're working on. Absolutely. For non-technical roles, I don't know if it's is important personally, but I don't know, maybe you can speak to that.
I was going to say, like, I'm a non-technical person, and like I will call out, I think from an accessibility perspective, I call out projects that I've worked on that may have something to do with that, right? So like a good example was at Microsoft, I was part of the team that launched this tool called Reading Progress within Teams. And the focus of it is an accessibility tool, yes, but like I'm clearly not the brains behind it or even working on the design piece of it. I'm working on like, what is the business model behind this? Like, why would we choose to make certain decisions, like make it available for free, based off certain things that we call out? And that's the extent of which that I can really speak about. But certainly, yes, I think if you were a tech designer, then they probably want to see what does accessibility mean to you and walk us through why you made certain choices.
All right, thank you. And I see a question in the chat. It's just sort of like advice on getting interviews, right? And that's really tough. I think, as I said before, personally, like you're gonna get rejected a lot. It's tough. It's going to happen, especially in tech when there are hundreds of thousands of people applying to the same job. With regards to interviews, just keep doing what you're doing. Keep networking. Referrals, I'm not sure if we've spoken about referrals at all, but referrals are pretty big in tech. I believe that most companies actually pay employees who refer someone, and actually if that person lands a role, then the employee gets a kickback. So a lot of employees at companies are sometimes actually like happy to refer you to a role as long as they have a conversation with you and they learn about what you're interested in. And you're more likely to get an interview if you have a referral. But I don't know, does anyone on the panel have more advice on how to get more interviews?
I just had a conversation with one of my friends is a UX designer and I guess also content oriented designer. And they were just asking like, hey, how can I land at a tech company? And I called out this piece on like, one, don't focus on just the big ones. Like there are hundreds of amazing companies that are not ginormous that are looking for tons of people. Two, the economy has changed now. I would say if you're looking for a way to say, hey, I'm still working on the thing that I want to be working on right now, go on Fiverr, go on Upwork, post a profile that you're able to do, this graphic design work, for example. There are thousands of people on these platforms and they're making a ton of money because they're working these contractor roles. It is no less like it is just as good as having another job. Honestly, it gives you a ton of flexibility, but it also allows you to say, is this the experience I want to have with this company? Like, is this a company I would want to work with? You be able to meet some employees and understand, like, is this a culture I think I would thrive in? It's a balance, but I do think the gig economy today allows you to be a lot more flexible and take your time with, like, where is it that I personally want to land and where I could see myself.
Yeah, I mean, I can add a bit to that. Ed is tough. I feel like that is one thing. There is no one easy way of doing. There's many different ways. But if I were to say any advice based on my own experience, is I'm saying again, develop a good LinkedIn like presence. You would be surprised by like how many folks will hit you up if you have a solid LinkedIn presence with solid experience and solid keywords. So that first and foremost. Secondly, to go and when you're applying, I think people have this idea, it's like become this thing of like celebrating, oh, I've applied to 100, 200, 300 jobs. Like instead of applying to as many jobs as possible with very little, customization on your resume, like be very explicit and be very focused in your job search. Don't apply for roles where you meet 20% of the qualifications or 30. I would generally say 60% or more with the jobs that I confidently apply to, and actually go and adjust your resume to each job a bit more of not a lot. Too bad to change like a bullet or two, but not a lot of customization, but it's customization. So it's a bit more for the job of that's secondly. And I would say, third of referrals and networking is a big thing. In tech, I know, I'm sure Anthony can speak at Google at Salesforce, it definitely is. We do get kickbacks and people get hired. I've referred probably 20, 30 people. So of connect with folks at companies, especially larger tech companies, for referrals specifically, because it gives you a slight heads up when you're going and applying. But yeah, no, it's hard for everyone. But do what you can. And I think Anthony mentioned too about like alternative resources, like contract roles are a thing. I know a lot of my friends have kind of gone through the contract route actually, or started with contracting through companies at certain organizations and then moved into a full-time role of contractor work. Tends to be a bit more easier to get than full-time roles, but of course contract role is some people may need more benefits that don't always come with the contract work, so that's also a thing to take consideration.
Yeah, my understanding of contract roles is that they usually pay a lot of money, like they pay more than full-time roles in a lot of ways, but they are a little bit riskier, but they're also easier to get, right? Like it might only take like 1 or 2 interviews in order to get a contract role, whereas when you get a full-time role, it takes like maybe 6, and there's more competition and there's more risk that a company might be taking on someone if they don't work out with a full-time role. So yeah, really good advice. Brian, I wanted to ask you about the resume question or the interview question, but I also see a question about software engineers and what qualities have made them a great colleague. And I feel like as a Scrum Master, you've probably interacted with some software engineers. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got a bunch.
Okay.
My favorite ones so far, I mean, I'm still getting to know a bunch of them, but they are open to changing the way they do things so that for the best of the team, which is a lot of people, I think, don't think about how much teamwork there is in software development, because if you think about yourself as a coder, a lot of people think, if I'm gonna learn code, I'm just going to sit there and code. And that's what a lot of developers like to do. But the best ones are really open to getting really good at their craft, but also adjusting so that the whole, because you work on a feature as a whole team. You're not just going to be a solo eagle person doing your own thing yourself, unless you're building your own thing on the side. If you're with a company, you're going to be part of a team. And so the best of those are open to shifting their processes is the best way I can think to put it, because some people really like to do it a certain way and some people are more open to changing it up a little bit.
Yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit too. As a business analyst, I interact with a lot of software engineers as well. My role is essentially to take the needs of the program or the business and translate those needs to developers, write tickets, and then work with developers in order to make sure that they deliver on a product that works for our business. And I think some of the best engineers are the ones who are able to like ask really good questions, right? And like really get down into the details and nitty gritty and like understand what the actual problem is, because a lot of times people will come to me and they'll be like, we have a problem and here's the solution.
Yeah.
And engineers really, like good engineers really understand the problem, and they're like, but we can do X, Y, and Z, and this will solve the problem. This will solve the problem even better. So like really asking the questions to get down into the nitty gritty of what the actual issue is has been something that's been really beneficial for me when I've been working with software engineers as well.
I think Joseph was was waiting to ask this, but that question in the chat's really good if I could answer that.
Yeah, go for it.
Please
So
do.
this, yeah, because this is tricky. I had to think about this a lot because there was a lot of LinkedIn in my network where it was just teachers complaining and wanting to get out, and that didn't look good. And so I actually made a post once that was like, hey, can we stop complaining? You're making all the other teachers look bad. And that kind of blew up and had some negativity and some people agreeing and some people were like, people should be able to post what they want and you can have your opinion on that. But I will tell you that if somebody sees your posts or in an interview, it's complaints, they're gonna be like, well, what's stopping you from complaining here? Because this is hard too. Like everybody thinks what they're doing is hard. So the reason you want to jump needs to be, you're not leaving because it's bad. Everybody knows it's bad, but you need to think about when you're leaving for something. Don't leave from something, leave for something. So for me, I communicated that I wanted to have a wider impact. So this company has 6,000 districts that they work with and 8 million teachers or so. I think I'm messing up the numbers, but like huge numbers of teachers. And so I would say I can actually have an impact on millions and millions of kids from what I'm doing. Whereas in a classroom, I have a much more direct impact, sure, on my 100 kids a year. But getting out into this company, I can make a significant impact indirectly on millions. And that's really exciting. So that was me personally, but something like that where you're making that jump because either teaching is limiting or it's, hard or something like that. Those don't ring as well as your company has this ability to give me the opportunity. And that's why I want to jump.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I think that like one of the things that a lot of interviewers need to do when they're answering that question is just talk about how much they really love teaching. Like like they can say like, I love kids, I love relationships, I love teaching, but I'm ready to make a change. Like I'm ready to make an impact. Like when you start talking negative about your former employer, then it comes off really kind of yucky in an interview. So just keep it positive, talk about what you like about your job, and then say, but I really like this job even more. That's I don't know, one thing that's top of mind for me. All right, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Brian and Anthony and Kendrick, for just giving all of your insight and wisdom. This is your last chance. If you want to like drop your LinkedIn or like say like a last word in the chat, go for it. But just wanted to thank everyone for coming to the Boston EdTech Foundation event. It has been great seeing all of you. And we're going to be having more events like this in the future. You are all amazing.
Thanks, everybody. Had a great time.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice chatting with y'all.